Millennials and childhood utopia. In my opinion, it's would be pretty hard to argue against the proposition that potentially a majority of millennials grew up through their childhood essentially in an artificial utopia instituted by adults and the school system. Very little violence, very little confrontation, really. Absurd levels of nannying and safety, helicopter parenting being like what that is. And so a lot of the perception of, I guess, threat or danger, but really the thing is the perception of normal, I guess, would be probably the best way to describe what I'm talking about. But that sort of perception rule set where you see something and you compare it with like your past experiences to see if this thing is normal or abnormal, I guess, to sort of assess threat. But in general, it's a pretty obvious like evolutionary brain processes to do this. That system was completely BTFO'd by this childhood of privilege and imposed equality, like this childhood utopia that a lot of millennials grew up in. And because of that, when they hit the real world, or not even the real world, like out of college, which I guess is what most people mean when they say the real world, but when they hit reality as a set of concepts, like slavery would be, probably the first one they encountered, like the American history of slavery and the Civil War. But, you reach like the genocide of, not all, obviously, because we got reservations, we've got Native Americans, but the partial genocide of many Native Americans. It's not a pleasant thing. And if you understand in depth some of the historical context, it's a bit easier to understand why it happened. And if you understand the historical context to some extent, the majority of people were not really guilty of genocide against the Native Americans, because, for one, a lot of the genocide, quote unquote, was basically just the spread of disease, which no one had any control over. Although apparently people would deliver like smallpox blankets. That's kind of fucked. A lot fucked. Most people were just living lives there. It's not like your direct answer is just like, let's go kill the Indians and take their lands. It was more along the lines of, there's all this land here and we don't want people killing us for making a home somewhere. And there was a lot of miscommunication between, well, just about everybody. And basically all the charlatans of Europe moved here to make quick money. So it's not fair to, say, blame America for all of the evils that have happened since the white man arrived. But because these things are not really discussed until people get older and have hit puberty and these kind of things, there's like a visceral negative reaction to it, that because of the removal of well, things sucking, this childhood utopia has made those things significantly more dramatic than they otherwise would be in the millennial psyche. Um, and they're not contrasted well in the telling of history with literally the rest of history, which is pretty much all just people killing other people. It's like horrifying if you actually look into history. Like, everybody was awful up until the Renaissance, and then they were like slightly above awful, and they were figuring out that awful was bad, and we're like, hey, we shouldn't be awful. And then the end result of the Renaissance, which is a very white European Western thing, was, hey, slavery is bad. And then you get sort of to the industrial age, and it's like, well, abusive power relationships aren't great, so let's get the kids and the women out of sweatshops and essentially slave labor in industrial factories and try and be like marginally humane to our own populations. This was, of course, after all of the stuff that had happened in America, for example. The industrial age sort of made us realize that people need to be treated with the basic level of humanity no matter their wealth, which was sort of a very, very, very fucking novel concept, which came out of the West and white people. And then, you know, we got World War II, and like, violence and war themselves are not good things. Like, before that, it was sort of a noble calling. And now it's kind of war is bad and cooperation is better. Like, these are all sort of advancements in social thinking that have occurred because of the West. Like, all of the good things that these people are like in favor of are white Western ideals, which we've spread to the rest of the world with varying degrees of success. And they're upset that before these things came in, these ideas came into being, we weren't always up to that standard. But the entire fucking species on the entire fucking planet was not up to that standard because nobody had an experience which created the idea of being more humane for each of these steps, like slavery and sweatshops and war, and now we've got like torture. Torture is bad. So people are now like opposed to torture, for example. And so it's just like building on humane behavior. But these are things have all come out of the West. And before they came out, people did not follow them as, well, I guess a society. The individuals probably did, but as a society, they weren't followed. And since they were raised in a vacuum and a artificial utopia of childhood, which was entirely insulated them from the fact that life sucks, and you know, we've only recently figured out how, like, ways of thinking that help us make life suck less. They encounter the fact that life used to suck more, and they're outraged by it, and this causes them to think that the current system, which is full of flaws, we'll be honest, is intentionally evil, when in fact the current system is just the best we've been able to develop with our systems of thinking. And there are probably, well, certainly, other aspects of systems of thinking that we can build upon what we currently have to improve the system. But the system is not intentionally evil, which is what they've placed upon it. The people in it, this system, are corrupt and do evil things, which is why the system has flaws. and probably because we haven't figured out how to fix certain flaws that we haven't found functional solutions to yet. But it's not intentionally evil, and that's where millennials go insane about it, is because of the childhood utopia that they grew up in, where all of these moral ideals that have been discovered in like the past 200, maybe 300 years were emphasized, and they were also isolated from the reason why these moral ideals became common among people. And so when they encounter the events, the history, the events in the past, which made these ideals common with people, they freak out because the thing that made these things common are awful, which is why we don't do them anymore, because we realize that they're awful. Instead of looking back and like, wow, stuff was awful, I'm glad that we have these better morals now. They're like, these are the best morals. And then all that awful stuff is because white people are evil. I mean, it's hard to compute for me because I'm like, I think about it, like, and then I apply stuff sort of with awareness of history, and I guess they don't have the awareness that things used to be different, not because people were more evil in history or something, but because people didn't have the system of thinking which builds like fairness and compassion and stuff as a higher degree, partly because life was harder back then and you couldn't focus on these things. I mean, the incredible amount of wealth we have now is a major reason why we can be more compassionate and humane with our moral systems. But they look back at the past and see bad things, and then look to the present and see not things that are not as good as the utopia that they were brought up in, and then say that the world is controlled by an evil conspiracy to make it worse and oppress people, which is wrong, because what's going on is that we're still figuring out how to cooperate and function as a species, and we haven't yet fully figured it out, but we figured out certain parts, and I that's as like far as I can take this train of thought at the moment, but that's sort of part of what's going on, I guess.